if you know me, you know that I do. I think there are always going to be moments where you feel as though a story is being told about some caricature of you that actually has nothing to do with you.
At exactly 7:32 this morning, December 2nd, a statement emerged from Buckingham Palace so stark, so final, that even veteran royal correspondents found themselves rereading it twice. The palace confirms that all future coordination with the Duchess of Sussex has been formally concluded. 16 words that landed like frost on glass, brittle and unforgiving. The announcement that changed everything. The notification arrived without ceremony, without the usual diplomatic cushioning that softens royal decisions. It appeared first as a bulletin on the palace's official communications channel, then rippled outward across every major network within minutes. BBC interrupted its morning programming. Sky News pulled analysts from their desks. And in the United States, where dawn had not yet broken on the East Coast, anchors scrambled to make sense of an announcement that felt less like clarification and more like severance. What made the moment so unsettling wasn't simply the content, it was the tone. Royal statements typically carry layers of softness, phrases like mutual understanding or continued respect. This one carried none of that. It was clean, surgical, absolute. The kind of language reserved for moments when an institution has reached the end of negotiation and moved into the territory of permanence. Outside Kensington Palace, the December morning air hung cold and still. A handful of reporters who had gathered for routine coverage found themselves suddenly at the center of a breaking story. One journalist, a woman who had covered the royals for nearly 2 decades, stood with her phone pressed to her ear and whispered to a colleague, "They've actually done it. They've drawn the line." Inside the palace walls, the atmosphere was equally taut. Senior staff moved through their morning routines with a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief because a decision that had been debated, delayed, and agonized over for months had finally been made. Apprehension because once such a statement goes public, there is no walking it back. The Crown had spoken, and the Crown does not retract. Across the Atlantic, the reaction was immediate and visceral. American morning shows devoted entire segments to parsing the language. Commentators noted the absence of any mention of reconciliation, any suggestion of future dialogue. One analyst on CBS described it as the coldest official distancing the monarchy has issued since the abdication crisis. Another on CNN pointed out that the timing, just as the holiday season approached, sent its own unmistakable message. This was not a pause. This was the end. For those who had followed the Sussex saga from the beginning, the announcement felt both shocking and inevitable. Shocking because, despite years of tension, many believed the palace would always leave a door slightly ajar. Inevitable because the warning signs had been accumulating for months, visible to anyone paying close attention. And now, on this December morning, the door had not simply closed. It had been locked from the inside. What exactly forced the palace to take this step? What pressures, missteps, and confrontations brought the monarchy to a point where silence was no longer an option? Stay with me, because the story behind this morning's announcement is far more layered, far more deliberate, and far more consequential than those 16 words reveal. The months leading to this moment. To understand why the palace moved so decisively on December 2nd, we must return to the quieter months that preceded it. Months in which small fractures widened, tensions deepened, and the royal family found itself navigating an increasingly untenable situation. Because this announcement did not arrive suddenly. It was built slowly, carefully through a series of events that made today's decision not just possible, but necessary. Throughout the autumn of 2024, King Charles faced mounting pressures. His health, though carefully managed and rarely discussed publicly, required a lighter schedule than originally planned. Palace aides adjusted his engagements, citing the need to preserve his energy for constitutional duties. This placed greater responsibility on Prince William, who was already balancing state obligations, his young family, and the steady expansion of his role as heir apparent. William had always approached his duties with measured seriousness, but by late September, those close to him noted a shift. He seemed more guarded, more deliberate in his public statements, and far less willing to entertain conversations about reconciliation with the Sussexes. It wasn't anger driving this change. It was something colder. A recognition that the institution he would one day lead could not continue absorbing disruption without consequence. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. Every few weeks, a new narrative would surface, sometimes in American media, sometimes through carefully placed interviews, sometimes via social media channels that seemed coordinated in their timing and messaging. The stories varied, but the effect was always the same. They pulled focus away from the working royals, reignited old controversies, and forced the palace into reactive mode. Princess Catherine, who had spent years building a reputation grounded in steadiness and service, found herself increasingly drawn into these narratives. Unnamed sources would suggest tension between her and Meghan. Reports would surface claiming internal conflicts over charitable initiatives. Speculation would swirl about her health, her schedule, her private life. Most of it was untrue. All of it was exhausting. Inside Kensington Palace, William watched his wife navigate this onslaught with grace, but he also saw the toll it took. Catherine rarely complained. She simply continued her work, raising their children, supporting her causes, and maintaining the kind of dignity that made criticism look petty by comparison. But William knew better than anyone that silence should not be mistaken for acceptance, and he was no longer willing to allow his family to serve as collateral damage in someone else's narrative strategy. By mid-November, palace communications teams were tracking a troubling trend. Multiple American outlets were running stories based on palace sources that did not exist. The sources claimed knowledge of internal discussions, private frustrations, and upcoming announcements. None of it was accurate, but the sheer volume of misinformation created a cloud of confusion that hung over every legitimate royal engagement. The Foreign Office began quietly expressing concern. Diplomatic partners in Washington, Ottawa, and Canberra were asking whether the Crown intended to address the Sussex situation more directly. The questions were phrased delicately, but the implication was clear. The ongoing instability was beginning to complicate relationships that depended on clarity and consistency. And then there was Camilla. Queen Camilla, who had spent decades rebuilding her own reputation, understood better than anyone how dangerous uncontrolled narratives could become. She had lived through the storm of public condemnation. She knew how quickly perception could harden into permanent judgment, and she feared that allowing the current cycle to continue would destabilize not only Charles, but the institution itself. In private conversations with William and Anne, Camilla expressed a view that surprised some who heard it. She believed that protecting Meghan from criticism had become less important than protecting the monarchy from chaos. It was not a statement born of malice. It was an observation rooted in survival. Institutions, she noted, cannot function when every week brings a new crisis manufactured from fragments of half-truths and strategic leaks. As November deepened and December approached, the palace found itself at a crossroads. Continue managing the situation reactively, absorbing each new wave of speculation and controversy, or act decisively, drawing a boundary that would end the uncertainty once and for all. The choice, though painful, was becoming increasingly obvious. The 5 warning signs. The shift from concern to action did not happen overnight. It unfolded through a series of warning signs, each one escalating in severity, each one pushing the palace closer to the decision announced this morning. And for those inside the royal household, these signs were impossible to ignore. The first warning came in late October during a private briefing Catherine received at Kensington Palace. She was reviewing her winter schedule when a senior communications advisor presented her with a disturbing pattern. Over the previous 6 weeks, more than a dozen articles across American media outlets had appeared, all suggesting friction between Catherine and senior palace staff. The articles used strikingly similar language, referenced the same vague timeline, and cited sources described only as close to the royal household. Catherine read through the summaries carefully. She recognized the tactic immediately. These were not independent reports. They were coordinated talking points, released strategically to create the impression of internal dysfunction. and they were designed, whether intentionally or not, to undermine her credibility during a period when her public profile was growing stronger than ever. What troubled her most was not the content. She had grown accustomed to false narratives. What troubled her was the timing. The articles appeared to coincide with her major announcements about early childhood initiatives, as if someone were deliberately trying to dilute positive coverage with manufactured controversy. When she brought this concern to William, his expression hardened. He had suspected coordination for months. Now he had confirmation. The second warning arrived through Princess Anne. In early November, Anne was reviewing international press coverage when she noticed something peculiar. Several high-profile American journalists had begun citing Buckingham Palace sources in their reporting about the Sussexes. The problem was, none of these journalists had clearance to speak with palace officials, and the information they were sharing contradicted official positions. Anne, who had spent decades protecting royal protocol with unwavering discipline, immediately flagged the discrepancy. A quiet investigation revealed that the sources were not palace officials at all, but individuals once connected to Meghan's team, now presenting themselves as having insider palace access. The deception was brazen, and for Anne, it crossed a line that could not be tolerated. She brought her findings directly to Charles, her voice calm but firm. "This is not gossip," she told him. "This is deliberate misrepresentation." The third warning came from an unexpected place. The Foreign Office, through discreet channels, informed the palace that renewed Sussex-related media cycles were creating diplomatic complications. Partners in North America were expressing frustration that every royal visit, every state function, every diplomatic engagement was being overshadowed by questions about internal family dynamics. One senior diplomat described it bluntly: "We cannot maintain the gravitas necessary for serious international relationships when the public conversation keeps circling back to who said what to whom 5 years ago." The message was clear. The monarchy's inability to resolve the Sussex situation was no longer just a family matter. It was becoming a governance issue. The fourth warning, the one that accelerated everything, surfaced in mid-November. Palace legal teams learned that a major documentary production company was developing a project centered on Meghan's royal experience. The proposal, leaked through intermediaries, outlined plans for a year-end release timed to coincide with the Christmas season. The documentary would feature new interviews, revisit old grievances, and frame Meghan's departure as a story of institutional failure rather than personal choice. William reviewed the proposal with barely concealed frustration. The timing was not accidental. Christmas was the monarchy's most symbolically important season, a time when tradition, family, and continuity mattered more than controversy. Launching a documentary designed to reignite conflict during that period was, in his view, a calculated provocation. The fifth and final warning came when Camilla, in a rare moment of open alignment with William and Anne, voiced her concern during a private meeting at Clarence House. She had been reviewing public sentiment data showing that older viewers, particularly in the United States, were growing weary of the endless Sussex narrative. Polling indicated that while sympathy for Meghan remained in certain demographics, a significant portion of the public, especially those over 50, believed the monarchy had been patient enough. Camilla's voice was steady but urgent. "If we allow this to continue into the new year," she said, "we risk losing the moral authority we need to lead. Charles cannot endure another season of this. The family cannot endure it, and the institution will not survive it." Her words carried the weight of someone who understood intimately what it meant to rebuild after public condemnation. And she was making clear that the time for rebuilding through patience had passed. The time for boundaries had arrived. By the final week of November, the warning signs were no longer subtle. They were glaring. And for William, who would one day carry the crown, the decision became unavoidable. The monarchy had to act. The breaking point. The meeting that would decide Meghan's fate took place on the evening of November 30th, inside the 1844 room at Buckingham Palace. The space, steeped in history and reserved for the most delicate discussions, felt colder than usual. Outside, winter rain tapped against the tall windows, and the faint glow of palace lights barely penetrated the December darkness. William arrived first, carrying a folder of documents, communications summaries, media analysis, legal briefings, Foreign Office correspondence. Each page represented another fracture, another reason why the current situation could no longer be managed quietly. He sat at the head of the table, his expression composed but his posture tense, the weight of what was about to unfold settling across his shoulders. Princess Anne entered next, her presence as steady as ever. She nodded once to William, then took her seat without ceremony. She had already made her position clear in previous conversations. The institution could not afford another year of reactive crisis management. Boundaries had to be drawn, and they had to hold. Queen Camilla arrived moments later, wrapped in a dark winter coat, her face set in an expression that balanced concern with resolve. She understood the emotional cost of what they were about to discuss. She also understood the necessity. Charles's health, the monarchy's stability, and the family's cohesion all depended on ending the cycle of disruption that had dominated the past year. When the private secretary closed the doors, the room fell silent. William spoke first. Before we proceed, he said quietly, "I want it understood that this decision concerns the future of the crown, not personal grievances. It was a deliberate framing, one designed to strip emotion from a conversation that could easily spiral into bitterness." Anne slid forward a stack of documents. "These," she said, "detail the coordinated media efforts we have tracked over the past 4 months. The pattern is unmistakable. Someone is actively working to destabilize our public narrative, and the evidence points consistently in one direction." Camilla added her perspective, her voice low but certain. "Your father cannot carry another season of this. He barely recovered from the last cycle. If we allow this documentary to launch at Christmas, it will consume everything we have worked to rebuild." William reviewed the materials again, though he had already memorized every detail. The false palace sources, the coordinated attacks on Catherine, the diplomatic complications, the documentary proposal designed to dominate the holiday season. Each piece on its own might have been manageable. Together, they formed a picture that could no longer be ignored. A senior legal advisor presented the final analysis. Under current circumstances, the Crown has 3 options. Continue as we have, absorbing each new wave of controversy. Issue a private warning through intermediaries which carries no guarantee of compliance, or make a public statement that draws a definitive boundary. The first option preserves short-term peace but guarantees long-term instability. The second option invites further testing of limits. The third option ends the ambiguity entirely. The room fell silent again. William looked at Anne, then at Camilla, then down at the papers before him. He understood what the third option meant. It meant publicly severing coordination with Meghan. It meant accepting that reconciliation, at least in any formal sense, was no longer possible. It meant choosing the institution over the individual. And it meant doing so in a way that could not be misinterpreted or softened later. Anne broke the silence. "William, you know what must be done. If we do not act now, we will face this same conversation again in 3 months, and then again in 6. The pattern will not stop unless we stop it." Camilla leaned forward slightly. "The statement does not need to be cruel. It simply needs to be clear. We are not attacking anyone. We are protecting something." William exhaled slowly. "Then we proceed. The statement must be final, unambiguous, and released before the documentary proposal gains further traction. No half measures, no room for reinterpretation." The drafting began immediately. Senior communications staff worked through the night, testing language, refining tone, ensuring that every word carried the weight of institutional authority without tipping into personal condemnation. William rejected multiple versions, too vague, too harsh, too apologetic. He wanted precision, he wanted finality, and he wanted the world to understand that this decision, however difficult, was irreversible. By dawn on December 2nd, the final draft was complete. 16 words that would reshape the monarchy's relationship with the Duchess of Sussex forever. As staff prepared for release, William stood alone in the dim light of the 1844 room, knowing that, in a few hours, the world would understand what the palace had finally chosen: stability over sentiment, clarity over chaos, and the future over the past, the moment of release. The statement went live at 7:32 on the morning of December 2nd. It appeared first on the palace's official communications platform, a single sentence carried on a white background. The palace confirms that all future coordination with the Duchess of Sussex has been formally concluded. No explanation, no context, no softening. Just 16 words that landed with the force of a closing door. Within 60 seconds, notifications exploded across newsrooms worldwide. BBC interrupted its morning broadcast. Sky News scrambled its royal correspondents. ITV pulled analysts from their desks. And on social media, the announcement spread with a speed that surprised even those who understood the global appetite for royal drama. What made the statement so devastating was not what it said, but what it refused to say. There was no mention of continued respect, no reference to shared history, no suggestion that circumstances might change in the future. The palace had chosen language designed to communicate one thing and one thing only: this chapter is over. In California, where dawn had not yet broken, the notification reached Harry and Meghan's home shortly after 4 in the morning. Sources close to the couple described the reaction as stunned silence. Harry, who had spent years navigating the impossible space between loyalty to his wife and connection to his family, reportedly stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone down without a word. Meghan's response, according to those nearby, was quieter but no less profound. She had prepared herself for many outcomes: a private warning, a request for dialogue, even a public rebuke framed with diplomatic language. But this, a formal conclusion of coordination delivered without preamble or explanation, felt like something else entirely. It felt like erasure. Back in London, the palace braced for the inevitable storm. Communications teams fielded calls from journalists demanding clarification. Legal advisors reviewed the statement's implications for future interactions. Security teams assessed whether additional measures were needed, and senior royals, having made the decision collectively, now faced the task of defending it publicly through their silence. Princess Anne resumed her scheduled engagements with characteristic composure. Those who saw her that day noted her steady demeanor, as if the morning's announcement had been nothing more than routine business. But those closest to her understood the truth. Anne had pushed for this decision longer than anyone. And now that it had been made, she felt a grim satisfaction that the institution had finally chosen discipline over accommodation. William appeared briefly at a public event later that morning. He offered no comment on the statement. He did not need to. His presence alone, calm and unwavering, communicated everything the palace wanted the world to know. The decision was final. The monarchy was moving forward, and there would be no further discussion. Catherine, meanwhile, continued her work with the same grace that had defined her public life. She did not address the announcement. She did not react to the inevitable speculation. She simply carried on, embodying the kind of quiet strength that made the palace's decision seem not only necessary, but overdue. The fallout. The hours following the announcement revealed a world divided not by borders but by perspective. In the United Kingdom, especially among viewers over 50, the reaction was largely one of relief. Finally, many said, finally the palace has drawn a line. Radio call-in shows were flooded with callers expressing support for the decision, noting that the monarchy had been patient far longer than most institutions would have been. British newspapers, historically cautious about pushing too hard on the Sussexes, now felt emboldened to write more critically. The Telegraph ran an editorial praising the palace for choosing stability. The Times analyzed the decision as a necessary evolution in royal crisis management. Even outlets that had previously been sympathetic to Meghan acknowledged that the constant disruption had become untenable. In the United States, however, the reaction split sharply along generational and cultural lines. Older viewers, particularly those who remembered the Diana years, tended to view the announcement as harsh but understandable. They recognized the institutional pressures the palace faced and appreciated the clarity of the decision. even if they felt sympathy for Meghan personally. Younger audiences, especially those who had followed Meghan's journey from the beginning, reacted with anger and disbelief. Social media platforms erupted with accusations of institutional cruelty, racism, and abandonment. Hashtags demanding accountability trended for hours. Think pieces appeared across digital outlets questioning whether the monarchy had learned anything from its past mistakes. Inside Buckingham Palace, staff felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, certainly, that a lingering source of tension had been resolved, but also apprehension about what might come next. Meghan had remained largely silent in recent months, but silence could be temporary. And a woman with nothing left to lose and a global platform at her disposal was not someone the palace could afford to underestimate. Legal teams began preparing for multiple scenarios: a public response from Meghan, a media interview, a book, a documentary that moved forward despite the palace's statement. Each possibility carried risks, and each required careful contingency planning. The palace had drawn its line. Now it would have to defend it. For the broader royal family, the decision brought a kind of weary unity. Charles, though emotionally pained by the finality of it all, understood that the institution he had inherited could not survive another year of managed chaos. William and Catherine, relieved to have clarity at last, refocused their energy on the future they were building for their children. And Anne, ever the pragmatist, simply moved forward, secure in the knowledge that the crown had chosen survival over sentiment. Reflection and lessons. As the winter sun set over London on December 2nd, and the shock of the morning's announcement began settling into something quieter, a truth emerged that reached far beyond palace walls. This was not simply a story about royalty and protocol. It was a story about boundaries, consequences, and the painful clarity that sometimes arrives only when all other options have been exhausted. For Meghan, today's announcement represents something profoundly difficult. Not merely a loss of formal connection to the institution she once married into, but a confirmation that the bridge she may have hoped still existed has been permanently closed. That is a hard truth to absorb, especially for someone who has spent years navigating the impossible space between public expectation and personal authenticity. Yet there is a lesson here that transcends the specifics of royal drama. Institutions, whether monarchies or families or organizations, cannot function indefinitely in a state of unresolved tension. At some point, clarity becomes more valuable than hope. Boundaries become more protective than patience. And difficult decisions, however painful, become the only path toward stability. From my own perspective, watching this unfold, I found myself thinking about how often we encounter similar crossroads in our own lives. The relationship that cannot be repaired, the partnership that no longer serves anyone well, the situation that demands a choice, not because anyone wants to choose, but because continuing without clarity has become more harmful than any definitive answer could be. The palace's decision was not made lightly. It was not made in anger. It was made after months of escalating pressure, institutional strain, and the recognition that protecting the future sometimes requires letting go of the past. That is a truth many of us, especially those who have lived long enough to face our own impossible choices, understand intimately. For William, this moment represents both an ending and a beginning. An ending to years of reactive crisis management. A beginning to a new chapter where the crown's priorities are defined not by external disruption, but by internal purpose. He has chosen the path of clarity, even knowing it comes with emotional cost. And that choice, difficult as it is, reflects the kind of leadership his future role will demand. For Charles, the decision carries a different weight. He has lived his entire life balancing personal feeling with institutional duty. And today, once again, duty prevailed. It is a burden every monarch understands, but understanding does not make it lighter. As we close this chapter, one question lingers in the December air. What comes next? Will Meghan respond publicly? Will the silence hold? Will this truly be the final word, or simply the opening of another quieter conflict? The palace has spoken, the boundary has been drawn, and the monarchy, battered but upright, has chosen its future. Whether that future holds peace or simply a different kind of storm remains to be seen. But for now, on this cold December morning, one truth stands clear. Sometimes the most compassionate thing an institution can do is stop pretending the past can be recovered and start building something new from what remains. As the lights dim over Buckingham Palace tonight and the December cold settles deeper into the stone corridors, the story we have witnessed today is not truly an ending. It is a pause, a breath before whatever comes next. The palace has spoken with a finality that cannot be undone. Meghan must now navigate a future without the institution she once belonged to, and the monarchy must prove that the boundary it drew today was worth the cost it will inevitably pay. For those of us watching from afar, the lesson remains achingly simple. Closure, however harsh, is sometimes the only mercy left when every softer option has been exhausted. Institutions survive not by clinging to what was, but by choosing what must be. And families, royal or otherwise, endure not because they avoid difficult truths, but because they eventually find the courage to speak them aloud. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, I would be honored to know your thoughts. This story reaches across borders, generations, and perspectives, and your voice, wherever you are, adds depth to how we all understand what happened on this cold December morning when the crown finally chose its future.